Hello everybody and welcome to another live stream. It's Monday night here in the UK. The current weather is verging on the inclement, as this is British summertime. We get summer out of the way early here, and now we're rolling straight into autumn. It's great fun. We've also got a new weather scare story, which I'll drop in before we get to the main business of the evening. When we have around about a couple of feet of water coming in, every idiot on Twitter takes a photo of a street that's got some minor flooding on it and says climate change. No one ever says collapsing infrastructure or water company not updated the sewerage in 20 to 30 years. It's always an apocalyptic thing, which of course requires absolutely nothing from capital in terms of political demands most of the time, from these screeching liberals who are just looking for a chance to post some apocalypse porn. But that's Britain today, and as the title of this stream is Britain Loses the Plot, I'll be returning to the deranged world of the British ruling class later on. But we will pause now to say hello to the people in the chat. Hello to James Graham, Z back at you. Red Star Betty, good evening to you. Ash, good morning to you from Melbourne. Good to see our Australian friends joining us. Jason, hello. We about to hear some LaRouche nonsense. Well, not from me, mate. If you want LaRouche, I'm sure there's plenty of MAGA communists who can provide that to you. So, yeah. Right. Good evening to Zuleika, good afternoon and good evening to Lavitz. Hello to M. Philbin. Hello to Kenneth in Norway. Hello to my comrade Naylor. How you doing? Hello to Morgan. So, now we move into the business of the evening, which is, of course, a discussion of various things that have happened today. The generalized theme is that Britain loses the plot and slides into insanity. So we will be focusing on an article which I did mention yesterday by a gentleman by the name of Simon Tisdall, and I want to focus on it because it is an example of both hysteria and cowardice, which is what the British ruling class and its laughably entitled figures that are referred to as intellectuals are specialising in at the moment. But before we get to that, I would be remiss in my duties if I did not begin the evening by visiting the absurd bizarreness of the Unite Union Policy Conference and its decision today to vote overwhelmingly in favour of the retention of the link to the Labour Party and voting down motions that were put to its conference today in favour of disaffiliation. And this, you might say, is somewhat predictable. Unite and its predecessor unions have been stuck onto the Labour Party from the very beginning. And, of course, this 100-year-long tradition of absolute wretchedness produces a big layer in all the trade unions that are affiliated to the Labour Party of people whose jobs are dependent upon continued affiliation. That builds a big layer of bureaucratic support. And, of course, it points to a wider problem in the British left, which is principally based in, well, the trade union bureaucracy is one of its big bases, and the entire mentality of the British left is basically stuck on a repeat loop, desperately trying to find a way to go back to the great social democratic period of 1945 to 1951, whilst, of course, not understanding why 1945 to 1951 was a thing. Was possible to do in the first place in terms of those social democratic reforms, but they're desperately trying to seek it out anyway, which of course, given that they have that social democratic mentality, that social democratic point of view, they inevitably go back to the Labour Party again, over and over and over again, or various failed experiments to create a new version of the Labour Party. And I should know, I've been a member of some of them. I've stood for Parliament for some of them. So I know what I'm talking about when it comes to embarrassing political disasters. So, the Unite conference with a lot of hype going into it that Sharon Graham, the somewhat grassroots challenger, given that she wasn't the chosen candidate to succeed Len McCluskey, the former General Secretary, She was expected to make trouble for Keir Starmer or threaten disaffiliation. She did nothing of the kind, of course. She completely rolled over and backed affiliation, having said the previous day that it was a disgrace that the Labour Party wouldn't back a decent pay rise for public sector workers. And around about a third of Unite's membership, I think, are public sector workers. It's principally a private sector union. It's the union in Britain that organises a lot of the engineering and high-skilled worker professions. So it's not the majority of their membership, but it's a big and important part of their membership. And of course, there was a big thing going on here with the bin workers, or if you're American, refuse workers strike in the city of Coventry, which again is a Labour council, and the Labour council were relentlessly attacking the terms and conditions of these workers. And these workers were pointing out through their union, to their union, Unite, that, well, hang on, we're paying every year this political levy that goes to the Labour Party. And the people who are attacking our terms and conditions as workers in the public sector are Labour councillors who take union money to run their electoral campaigns. And this isn't the first time, of course. I, of course, live in Manchester, and it's been a Labour council forever. It's basically a cartoonish one-party state in Manchester and Salford, and most of the other areas of Greater Manchester as well. It's overwhelmingly dominated by the Labour Party. So whenever public sector workers that work for a local authority here run into any trouble, it's the Labour Party that's the opposition. It's the Labour Party cutting their pay. It's the Labour Party cutting their jobs, hiding behind usually, oh, the Tories are making us do it. But of course, they never dreamed of resisting it for a moment. So any worker who can put two and two together, you don't need to be some kind of genius to work this out. He's like, well, why is our union paying for the careers of these people who are our enemies? And any worker who goes into struggle against a council that's run by the Labour Party will work that out very quickly. And of course, all the big names on the Labour Party left, of course, were remaining conspicuously silent over the Coventry bin strike last year, and loads of other examples of public sector workers running into difficulties, running into disputes with Labour-led local councils, as they would on the national scale if Keir Starmer ever gets back into government, which I think is increasingly unlikely. So Unite basically voted, or its delegates voted, for the union to continue to get kicked in the nuts by Keir Starmer, and everybody should go and read the statement that my comrades in the Class Consciousness Project put out today. I will post it in the chat. That sums up what a lot of active trade unionists will be thinking about today. It's just another case of the fact that you cannot trust, whether you're in Britain, whether in the United States, whether you're in any of the imperialist countries, all of these trade union bureaucracies are utterly rotten. They're all wedded either to the Labour Party. If you're in the United States, it's to the Democrats in slightly different ways, but with the same effective results. If you're in Canada, I think the abusive relationship there is with the Canadian version of the Labour Party, led by, what's his name, Jagmeet Singh. And in Germany, wedded to the Social Democrats. In Spain, wedded to the Spanish so-called Socialist Party. It's the same relationship everywhere, which is that these 100-year-long relationships between trade unions and the Social Democratic parties, or Liberal Party in the case of the United States, it's only going one way. The period where capitalism could offer, or was inclined to offer, any kind of reform has long since gone. The left in all of these countries keeps looking for some way back to the reformist period. They can't get it, so they just say, well, the best thing we can do is to stop those dreadful fascists like Donald Trump or Boris Johnson getting in. So they just fold again and try and funnel people back towards voting for the Social Democrats. And the workers who are, if they're in unions or not, the workers can calculate very well when they're getting stiffed, and they know they're getting stiffed by the Labour Party or by the American Democrats or by the Canadian Liberals, and they know that it's that the union leaders are putting a con over on them if they're going to tell them to vote for this wretched party that attacks them constantly, that they know instinctively is their enemy. So why on earth would they vote for it? And more to the point, you get a lot of workers getting disillusioned with unions who basically lead them up the path of struggle, then sell them out for the purposes of the Labour Party. So this is all in the mix here. Until we break decisively with not just the unions being wedded to the Labour Party in a very destructive fashion, until we break with that, then essentially the working class struggle is going to be hamstrung, truncated, useless. Because ultimately, when it comes down to it, all the Labour Party's got to do is to say to the union leaders, well, it's us or the Tories. And then the union leaders will sell out any struggle possible. I will point you in the direction of an interview I did back at the beginning of this year with Dr. Bob Gill. He's a physician, works in the NHS. He's a long-time campaigner against NHS privatisation. And he said something very interesting in that interview with me, where he said it was back in 2006 that the health service union leaders essentially agreed to not make a big deal about the NHS being privatised by the Labour Party government at the time, in return for some concessions on paying conditions, which didn't last more than a few years, which the Tories came in and eviscerated anyway. And for that, they basically got the unions, the potentially very powerful health unions, with a potentially big voice that could be used to mobilise opinion against NHS privatisation. They got them to be quiet about the Labour Party's actions on the NHS. So this is the role that the union leaders play. And again, until we break that, which we will need to do, until the working class can break away from this party and from this bureaucracy which weds us to this party, we're going to be stuck struggling with one hand tied behind our backs at best, or just not struggling at all. And so this is a contemptible decision. This Sharon Graham is a disgrace, and it is unfortunate that anybody could really have seen this coming. Even if she was more determined to break the link with the Labour Party, what it would mean is, to actually break the link with the Labour Party, you would have to go on and take on the bits of the bureaucracy in Unite or Unison or GMB, or you can extend this to other countries too, to the bureaucracy of like the AFL-CIO in the United States. You would have to break that bit of the bureaucracy which has its career and its paychecks tied to the Labour Party, which is an awful lot of the trade union bureaucracy in this country. So you would need to lead a determined struggle against them first. But ultimately, there's a far bigger picture here, which is that the ruling class, the British ruling class, wants the trade unions to continue to be tied to the Labour Party. Because ultimately, the British ruling class knows very well that by having the unions tied to the Labour Party, that is a big assistance, a big piece of assistance for them in keeping the unions and keeping working class struggle firmly under control. You know, that's how these things work. That's how the British state certainly would see this. So it wouldn't just involve taking on the bureaucracy inside their own unions, which would be more than most of these union leaders are capable of. It would mean ultimately a collision course with the British state, because that's who stands ultimately behind the political establishment. It's the permanent state, the deep state, whatever you want to call it. And they are the ones who want to keep the union movement firmly under control and to keep its leadership embedded within the state structures of British capitalism. And the Labour Party affiliation is a very efficient way of doing that, and it's been a very efficient way of controlling trade union activity for over 100 years now. It's been a lot of comments, so I will pause now to go through some of them. So, Paul Charo, I hope me being here doesn't exceed the Australian quota for this stream. Well, you're lucky there's no one from New Zealand here, mate. Otherwise, the Antipodean quota would have been overloaded. But seriously, hello, good to have you along. Search and Research, good afternoon from Chicago, Solidarity. Hello, Chicago. Only been there once. It was a long time ago, and I was passing through, I think it was O'Hare Airport in 1997. Hello to HM. Stephen Newbury says corruption, I think referring to the trade union leaders, quite possibly. Paul Chiaro, good evening, Norway, Chicago. Hello, hello, hello. Stephen Newby says Labour is hardly social democratic anymore. Well, it's reformism without reforms, Stephen. Hello to Zuleika. And so where are we now? Red Star Betty, glad you liked the Class Consciousness Project. Statement on that. Zuleika asks a question. Why do you think it's increasingly unlikely he gets in as PM? I have my doubts about Starmer getting in because he's performing so appallingly badly when it comes to doing quite basic things that a bourgeois politician should be able to do, which is do public appearances without looking like a complete buffoon, and answer the puff piece questions, the softball questions that the bourgeois press tosses to him. Because the ruling class, reason why they wanted Starmer to come in, or at least a faction of them wanted Starmer to come in, was because they need the Labour Party to play its traditional role of appearing to be a change whilst not actually being a change, and also being able to use its position with regard to the trade union bureaucracy to stifle and crush and atomise working class struggle. That and do a lot of other things which they've done in the past as well, which is stuff like increase the division between different elements of the working class by leaning harder into sort of racialist politics, which is what the Blair government did all the way through the 2000s. People ask where the BNP vote came from. Well, it got whipped up by the Labour Party. Go back to 20 years ago and look the kind of stuff that Griffin was saying. Nick Griffin, that is, the BNP leader. He wasn't too far away from the kind of things that David Blunkett and Phil Wallace and other Home Office ministers for the Labour Party were saying. And bear in mind, the Labour Party government helped create an atmosphere where racialism became more widely accepted again. They get all this credit from Liberals for passing laws against discrimination, but people forget the extremely nationalistic, flag-waving, racialist language that they use, particularly around the Iraq war on terrorism, things like that. Their posturing over asylum seekers and refugees, all of this stuff that they did, which prepared the ground for the BNP and made them, in many respects, indistinguishable from the BNP. That's why I never bought into the whole vote Labour to stop the fascists thing. It's well, the Labour Party and the fascists are part of the same machine. And without the Labour Party's role, you don't get the fascists to the extent that you did. So, moving back to Zuleika's question, though, the reason why that the ruling class might be having a bit of doubts about Starmer is that he's not a very good politician. To be able to carry off the things that Labour needs to do in office, all the things I just mentioned, you need a figure like Blair, who is at the very least a good actor, who can deliver the lines, deliver these bland statements that don't really mean anything to the public, go on TV and wave his finger around and look like he's really serious. What an effective bourgeois politician is, which is basically a convincing actor who can do all the things that the ruling class require and carry enough of the petty bourgeoisie and the upper end of the working class with the Labour Party or the Tories, depending upon who's in power. And for that, you've got to have a good frontman. Now, Starmer is not a good frontman. He's a terrible politician. He's got away with it up to this point in his entire career because he was a career bureaucrat in the Crown Prosecution Service and was clearly a man who was not a very good trial lawyer because he's clearly not able to think on his feet very well. He's clearly not very bright either. And he's just been a yes man in the internal bureaucracy of the British state for his entire career. Now, he recently got busted. It was on the Declassified UK website. They've been trying to get hold of the records of why he was in Washington so much in 2009 to 2010 when he was still head prosecutor, because neither his immediate predecessors nor his successors have been to Washington anything like the number of times that Starmer was going there in those 2 years. And strangely enough, the internal records of what he was doing there, who he was meeting with and what he was talking about have all gone missing. They've all been destroyed. And that's the exact same time, of course, as the case against Julian Assange was being prepared, and we know that Starmer had a role in stitching him up. So, presumably, I think we can make a good guess here that part of what he was talking about was the Assange case, and he was doing that because he's a yes man. He's a yes man for the British deep state. He's a yes man for the United States. He's essentially just a guy who's made his entire career by making himself useful to those immediately above him in the chain of command. Now, that can take you a long way. But to be an effective bourgeois politician, you've got to have a bit more than that. You've got to be able to act a bit. You've got to be able to think on your feet a little bit. That's why, they like people like David Cameron or Tony Blair. These are more convincing frontmen. That's why they even were prepared to put up with Boris for a little while, because he could give it the whole, oh, I'm a, clueless toff, me, I don't know what I'm doing. That whole act was quite popular. Starmer's just not very good at any of that. And more to the point, he's hated already by large elements of the population. Like, people might not have trusted Blair, but there was, not very strong opinions on him really before 1997, and he was at least embraced by elements of the middle class. But Starmer, there's no enthusiasm for him. There's no belief that he will make anything better, and he himself is an awful and unconvincing leader. So with that in mind, elements of the ruling class might be thinking one of two things. Well, first of all, maybe we should dump Sunak, bring in somebody like, I don't know, Kemi Badenoch's been talked about to be a new, the latest sort of front woman for the Conservative Party, try and revive them a little bit. Or Starmer does get over the finishing line, but does so with like this horrific coalition of Labour and the Lib Dems and whatever the Greens managed to get. And it's a complete disaster. Either way, I think what we're going to get out of the next election in Britain is a very weak government, which I think is the best possible solution. A strong government led by either the Tories or Labour Party is a bad idea for working class struggle. If we can get a weak government of either one of them, in my view, that's better. So I hope that answers your question. Morgan says, you don't know Labour like I do. You don't understand how tender and loving Labour is behind closed doors. Abusive relationship. Indeed it is, Morgan. Hello from Spain, says Tomsk. Hello, right back to you. Stephen says, hello everybody, can I ask the chat a question? Is Trump or Boris really seen as a fascist by actual leftists? In my mind, they're both classical liberals with more than a large dose of narcissism. Well, the question of whether actual leftists think that Trump or Boris are fascists. The problem is, Stephen, that leftist organisations in Britain and the United States aren't doing analysis when it comes to Trump or it comes to Boris. What they're doing is opportunistic sloganeering. That's all they're doing. Pandering to a petty bourgeois audience, pandering to hysterical pseudo-radical students. I mean, I'll give you an anecdote to illustrate this point. When Trump was elected, we saw in Manchester bigger demonstrations than we'd seen for any of like national mobilizations against anything that David Cameron had done in the previous 6 years. And the whole thing kind of opened up a sort of a bit of a revelation for me, because suddenly, like, you saw all these like thousands and thousands of students and middle class people coming out to protest about the election of a president of the United States, which I know that Britain has an unhealthy relationship with the United States, but from our perspective, from the ruling class's perspective, it's perfect. But it was a bizarre over-association with it, and what I noticed was that a lot of people were basically you got a lot of middle-class people essentially cosplaying like some rise of fascism thing, and the left going right along with it. So anybody who seriously analyzes Trump or Boris, like Trump, as I've said before, he's like a 1980s New York Democrat. That's who he is, who pays off people in, of both political parties to get his building permits cleared. His politics are like basically a New York Democrat from the 80s. He hasn't changed those, really, in over 30 years. And so Boris Johnson's basically a liberal. And he was beloved by like the media leftists until, of course, Brexit. So no, this isn't serious analysis at all. But then again, there's very few leftists who do serious analysis. So Zuleika says, I think you're referring to Starmer having no finesse. Yes, Starmer has no finesse and no brain. Stephen says, you're absolutely right about Starmer, but I don't think they really care enough about appealing to the electorate, since any mandate would only lead to expectations of him making things better. I think that the part of the ruling class would like a solid Labour government, because for precisely the reason you say, Stephen, which is if they got a decent sized majority, yes, that would conjure up hope of them making things better. And then they'd engage in some kind of like pandering, some stunts, which is what Blair used to do. And then, of course, their job is then to crush any expectation of change, and more specifically, crush any expectation of movement in terms of working class life improving. And then the job of the Labour Party is to kill all those expectations, kill any movement in the trade unions. Then when they fail and fall apart, their job then is to give way to a revived Conservative Party. So that's the role that Starmer was supposed to play. He's showing that he's not very good at it. Thank you, Zuleika, for the reminder. Right. Okay, I think I've missed some comments here, so I will pause. Right. HM says, Michael Hudson's recently stated that it said if Russia wins, they'll be in a strong enough position to demand US admits culpability in Bucha. Any realistic chance of that happening? No. I think that's wrong. Quite frankly, I don't think that the US will admit it. Now, the Hudson may be referring to the International Criminal Court warrant that was issued against Putin. I think when the Russians win and the US is forced to negotiate with them, that will be quietly just dropped. The ICC will withdraw it pending further investigation, and the whole thing will be quietly put to one side. They won't admit culpability, though. And really, I think the US is culpable ultimately, but I think the real movers and shakers on that were, of course, the Ukrainian fascists themselves, with strong encouragement, shall we say, from the British special services. So I don't think there's any chance of them ever admitting that out in the open. Ash says, this is such a similar story to Oz unions sticking their head up Labour Party's bum. Labour is currently in power and pushing through harsh austerity, which the unions are whitewashing. Same story here. I mean, I remember talking about Australia when those construction workers' protests broke out against Dan Andrews, I think it was, and the response of the union's leaders was to call them all fascists. Then you investigated the conditions of Australian construction workers, and you found that the unions have basically been doing the same thing in construction that they've been doing here, which is selling out to the Labour-led regional government and national governments. And essentially their membership in construction had been withering away for years as the industry got casualised. And then they wondered why thousands of workers who were on casual contracts, who then got fucked over by the COVID closures, they suddenly went out and protested and didn't regard the union as their friend because the union had never done jack shit for them. And the response of the union organisers would say, fascists. And, well, what are you surprised? Why are you surprised? If the union's never done anything for workers and left them right in the ship and is backing up a despised politician like Dan Andrews, well, it's not a surprise that the attitude of many unorganised workers who don't have a high level of class consciousness is going to be, well, fuck the union. Because that's where it leads us. And this is the danger that we face if the unions keep clinging to these rotten parties that huge elements of the working class hate, with good reason. Right, where are we? Paul Chiaro, glad you liked the joke. Right, Ed and David's disappointed father, Ralph. I didn't know you were still with us. The deep rot that grips the economic base pervades into the political structure itself. Labour cannot produce in the same successful actor leader like Blair in this corroded political economy. Yes, Blair himself was a successful politician because he at least had been through some testing times in the internal struggles of the 1980s. Keir Starmer is just a flabby yes man. And he's perfect for a reformism now that cannot even offer like the microcosm of reforms that Labour in the 90s did, which wasn't a great total anyway. M. Philbin says, Comrade Sir Keir Starmer, the socialist knight, a wolf in sheep's clothing who cried anti-Semite. Indeed, and good rhyming as well. Yeah, Starmer will say and do anything, but he won't say it in a very convincing fashion. So that's the rundown on Unite at the moment. And the other thing I wanted to drop in before we get to the Simon Tisdall article was, of course, the twisting and turning of Erdogan. But before that, I must visit the comment from Naylor. On a scale of 1 to 11, where would you put Agent Mason's new flowchart? If you haven't seen it, Paul Mason has returned with a new mind palace. And I believe that those of us watching this stream now may well be on there somewhere. I will drop the tweet that he has put out there on this, if I can find. Here we go. Paul Mason, where are you? You scumbag. Oh dear, I didn't realize Paul Mason's got pronouns in his bio in Welsh. He's still pandering. He's still pandering to that Welsh safe seat that he's never going to get. So where are we? Where are we, Paul? Where is your mind palace? Right, here we go. So I'll just drop this into the chat so you can all admire this genius. Yes, it's a brilliant new piece of art, which, as you can see from this fantastic tweet, is he's moving very much more in the direction of circles now, which is a great theme for an artist. In fact, what I'll do is I'll put this as an image onto the screen so you can all enjoy it. There you go. There you go. Enjoy that. Enjoy that piece of genius. That is, it takes this very certain type of British deep state agent to pull off this kind of genius. As you can see here, we can now look at the circle of the Red-Brown Alliance. As you can see, the middle of this series of circles is the coherent Red-Brown Alliance. And it includes Putinism, anti-Semitism, anti-IDPol, anti-liberalism, Confucianism, which is a new one on me. I'm going to have to find out what that is. Conspiracy and pro-Brexit. So let's just go through this one at a time. Are we, those of us in this stream right now, on this chart? So Putinism, well, of course. Anti-Semitism, no. So that's a mark against us. Anti-IDPol, yes. Anti-liberalism, yes. Confucianism, I mean, I'm not quite sure what this is about. Has he misspelt Confucianism? Is this a Chinese thing? I'm not sure. Conspiracy, pro-Brexit. Well, most of these we're falling into. So are we then part of the inner circle, which is the inner ring, so to speak, the coherent Red-Brown Alliance? I hope we are. I hope we are. I am disappointed that I haven't featured by name on his mind palaces yet. It can only be a matter of time. Maybe I should up my game on Twitter. But this is the kind of genius that MI6 is recruiting these days. And yes, let's hear it for the coherent Red-Brown Alliance. This is clearly the new thing that the ruling class is going for. This is maybe what his handler has given him. So yes, a dingo ate me baby asks, where's Duginism? Yeah, I'm quite disappointed to not see Duginism on there. or reactionary Heideggerian revanchists, perhaps. No, Zuleika, it wasn't a meme. This is actually what he spends his time doing. Presumably somebody is paying him for this service. If you'll excuse me there, I must take a traditional British slurp from an enormous cup of tea. So yes, this is what former Newsnight economics editor Paul Mason spends his time doing now. It's coming up with bizarre variations of mind palace charts. So yes, I think on 1 to 11, Naylor, to answer your question, it's probably an 11. I mean, like the old line from Spinal Tap goes, these go one louder. That's one crazier. So speaking of crazy and British, I wanted to draw your attention to an article by a fellow by the name of Simon Tisdall. He is one of the interchangeable liberal hysterics who write for the Guardian newspaper. And so I will draw your attention to a very, very funny article that he wrote the other day, which typifies the hysteria and cowardice of the British ruling class, where he appears to be calling for greater British involvement in the Ukraine war. But then when you get actually into it, well, he's calling for something else entirely. So let's enjoy this particular piece of madness. I'm going to put up several quotes here and read through them, and then we'll discuss. So Tisdall wrote this just the other day, and he says, there is a risk if the current counter-offensive produces no breakthrough, which it isn't, weapon supplies run short and a new winter energy crisis strikes and Western public support drops further, that Zelensky will be forced into negotiations, even into trading territory for peace. Secret, informal US-Russia talks are already underway. If Ukraine were already a NATO member as promised 15 years ago, this would not be happening, which is very funny in terms of the fantasies involved there. But the actual reality is, of course, that the reason why Ukraine didn't join NATO 15 years ago, why Ukraine isn't joining NATO now, why Ukraine will not be joining NATO at the summit coming up this week is, of course, because for precisely the reason that Joe Biden outlined the other day, which is they don't want to get into a direct war with Russia. If they'd have tried this in 2008, the likelihood is that you would have ended up with something akin to what actually happened in Georgia, which is that the Russian army stormed in there. There was some initial difficulties, and then the whole Georgian state came close to collapse. And then, of course, Saakashvili was dumped. Now, could the Russians have stormed into Ukraine in 2008 and done something similar? Well, maybe not, because, of course, Yanukovych came back into power shortly afterwards and tried to maintain a position of balancing between the US imperialist bloc and the Russians. Ultimately failed. So in terms of NATO membership 15 years ago, that wasn't really on the cards because Yanukovych was ambivalent about it, didn't want to pursue it, didn't want to break relationships with the Russians. So it was a fantasy for Tisdall to cling on to that. Also, it's a fantasy that the idea is that Zelensky is the one in charge of these negotiations. He's not. I mean, this is what Tisdall doesn't mention all the way through the article, is that, of course, the reason why the peace talks collapsed was because the US blocked them. The US ordered Zelensky. They got Boris Johnson to deliver the order, but they ordered Zelensky to not proceed any further with the peace talks. And that's why the war has continued. So, again, Tisdall, typically dishonest, doesn't mention any of that, engages in like hysterical fantasies, and again, fairly standard stuff from him for now. We will then move to the next quote where he tries to act tough against these supposed European allies that he loves so much. So, they, that is the Europeans, he's here claiming, claim to be acting responsibly. But this too familiar milksoppery, which unnecessarily and unwisely restricts NATO's actions, is actually rooted in American and West European fears that Putin provoked might attack the West. This is such facile thinking even when sober. And when with the wind behind it, Russia's blundering army could not beat Ukraine's second 11. For all his threat, Putin fears Russia-NATO conflict too. For him, it would be political and military suicide. Well, this one's so stupid, I'm going to have to spend a bit more time on it. So, dealing with the claims, one after the other, shall we say. Right. First of all, what's blocking Ukraine's entry into NATO is in fact the United States. It is the United States itself. They actually don't want Ukraine in NATO. They wanted to have Ukraine being near to NATO membership, with NATO membership being constantly threatened, whilst at the same time never actually having to engage in the obligations to really defend Ukraine fully, as they would have to, in theory at least, if under Articles 4 and 5, if it were to be attacked. NATO and EU membership was meant to be dangled in front of Ukraine as a constant tempting offer, as something that they could get somewhere in the distant future. It was never meant to be delivered straight away. Ukraine was meant to be acting as an outsourced military establishment, a garrison essentially against the Russians, a source of destabilization against the Russian Federation. Ultimately, they hoped to, by constantly threatening the Russian presence in Crimea, destabilize the Russian government itself. So this is all what they wanted to achieve by offering Ukraine membership. And that, again, it was to be dangled as something that would help them control the Ukrainian ruling class, whilst never actually giving it to them, and thus evading their responsibilities. So this idea that, oh, well, they could have joined years ago if it wasn't for these objections, no. Ukraine joining was never meant to be the game. The game was that exactly what was played, which is after 2014, Ukraine is built up as a sort of outsourced military establishment against the Russians. And, of course, the Americans and the Europeans continue to build it up. So it will do the fighting. So Ukrainians will do the fighting and the dying. Not directly anyway, large numbers of American, British, French, German or Italian or Spanish soldiers, because that would be very difficult to maintain in these weakened imperialist states with very dubious connections to the masses, or very weak connections to the masses, playing on Mao's phrase again, who couldn't sustain a serious war drive. So again, they pay for Ukraine to do it, or they get Ukraine indebted to do it. So again, this is Tisdall being typically dishonest. So the other thing I have to comment on, though, is this idea that, of course, he repeats the same old bullshit about Russia being weak. Ukraine, you couldn't beat Ukraine's second 11. We're not on Ukraine's second 11. We're probably by now on their 5th or 6th or 7th 11. Yeah, the Russians have wiped out 2, 3, and are starting on a 4th Ukrainian army by now. They've killed 20,000 men inside the last month or so. All the Ukrainian forces that were trained in the West have been comprehensively destroyed. So this idea that, oh, well, they couldn't beat the Ukrainian army. They've beaten the Ukrainian army over and over and over again, killed hundreds of thousands of them. And the only reason why the likes of Tisdall can get away with telling this lie is, of course, that the way that the Russian war has evolved in such a way as that they are using sort of active defensive strategies rather than the sort of aggressive drive on Kiev, which will eventually come. So Tisdall continue to spin this fantasy of Russian weakness. But of course, the Russians now have an army of 800,000 and growing, have a massively improved military industrial capacity, can outproduce the entire collective West when it comes to military production. And Tisdall's still spinning his wheels like this is none of this is happening. So he's peddling complete fantasies here. And as to whether a conflict with the West would be political suicide or military suicide, I don't think it would. It would be suicide for NATO. It would be suicide for the European nations in particular, which is why they won't do it. And I think Tisdall on one level does know that. He's not a complete moron, even though he really does appear to be one. So let's now go on to the next quote. Although arms are flowing to Kiev, promises to boost eastern flank defences remain largely unfulfilled. Since the start of the war, for example, France's troop presence in NATO's east has risen from 300 to 969, Italy's from 350 to 385. In contrast, and now he gets excited, NATO's eastern members have undertaken historic build-ups that will see Poland soon possess more tanks than all of Western Europe combined. Meanwhile, US troop presence has risen from 5,000 to about 24,000. Yeah, still not enough to actually fight the Russians, Simon. Sorry to disappoint you there. As to the mention of Poland, now we start to see where this article is actually going. And this follows along from an article that was published recently by that foul old wretch, Andrew Neil. Now, the Andrew Neil article and what Tisdall is saying here is all about building up the idea of Poland as the great military garrison, because it's now Poland that these hyper-aggressive elements inside the British establishment are seeing as the next great defender of Western civilization. And this is where Tisdall's article is going. He's not arguing, actually, like the unhinged lunatic Tobias Ellwood was, for direct British involvement. What he's arguing for is the accession of Ukraine into NATO, not so that the British can fight Russia directly, but that these heroic Eastern European nations can go and do it for them. That's what they're arguing for. He's realizing that the project to turn Ukraine into the outsourced military base of the West has failed and is falling apart, so they need a new one. Well, Poland steps into the breach. And the idea of course, shoving the French and Italian and Germans into confrontation with Russia is, of course, appealing to certain elements within the British ruling class. But what he's actually talking about, again, is essentially a change of plan, or a slight change of plan. Get the Poles to fulfill the role that we wanted the Ukrainians to fulfill, have the Americans back them up in terms of air defense, in terms of weaponry. By the way, all these tanks that Poland is getting hold of, a lot of them are from Germany, a lot of them from the United States, Leopard tanks, Abrams tanks. They've given most of their old Soviet-era Warsaw Pact tanks, like the T-72s and what was left of their T-65s, have been given to Ukraine. So the Americans are now filling that void. But can Poland sustain the kind of military-industrial defense capacity that would enable them to wage a war against the Russians? No. What Tisdall seems to be hoping is that they can keep the war in Ukraine going, essentially by the Poles moving in and playing the same role that Ukraine is now, but with the conditionality attached to it that this doesn't escalate into a full-scale war with the Russians. And that's what they're counting on, the idea that they can move thousands of Polish troops and tanks and air cover into the territory of Ukraine, carry on the war as it is now, and that the Russians won't just immediately level most of Poland. That's what they're counting on. That's where this idea of Polish involvement comes from. This idea that they could get the Poles mobilized and involved and into Ukraine to save NATO's face, essentially, and that the Russians wouldn't dare shoot back because that means war with NATO and it would be suicide for Putin. Well, no, not politically. It wouldn't be, because, again, the Russian population is solidly behind him. And in fact, the Russian population is more strident in its opinions against the West than the Russian ruling circles are. So this idea that, Putin is terrified of NATO, no, he's not, and it wouldn't affect his popularity with the population either. Now, the reason why they have been hesitant all the way through this is because, of course, Russian capitalism didn't want to lose its relationship with or more to the point, its markets in Europe, but that's all gone now. So this idea that, we can now just shove the Polish army into Ukraine and that coward Putin, he won't do anything, that is completely foolish. And I think that even the Poles are starting to realize that that's foolish. Suddenly, they realize that Russia's going to have an army of about 1 million men, that they're not using all of their military capacity, that they're still fighting on the rules of the special military operation, that if Poland intervenes, then all those rules go and it's all-out war. And there won't be much left of Poland because the Russians have the capacity to destroy most of the military and industrial sites in that country inside about a week. So I don't know where Tisdall thinks this is going to go, but this idea that he's floating is a complete fantasy. a fantasy on the same level of Tobias Ellwood, just not quite as openly foaming at the mouth. But we move on. Now here he's talking about precedents for entering NATO. But there are precedents. West Germany gained NATO protection in 1955, even though, like Ukraine, it was in dispute over occupied sovereign territory. More on that in a minute. Held by East Germany, a Soviet puppet. In similar fashion, NATO's defensive umbrella could reasonably be extended to cover roughly 85% of Ukrainian territory Kiev currently controls. Well, let's deal first of all with this this idea that East Germany was Soviet-occupied territory. If the DDR was Soviet-occupied territory, then what did that make West Germany that was occupied by free foreign armies? The British, the French, and the Americans. So this is like a typical like Cold War liberal piece of bullshit. It's like they always say Soviet-occupied East Germany, and they just completely neglect the fact that, well, both Germany and Italy were and remain occupied nations. There's no more Soviet occupation. There's no more Soviet Union of those countries, yet the American occupation remained. It's like these liberals completely overlook the fact that these countries have been occupied by American forces for over half a century, for almost 80 years. And given also the fact that Eastern Germany was far more sovereign than Western Germany was, and far more sovereign than current Germany is, the control exercised by the United States imperialists over Germany is far greater than any control that the Soviets exercised over the government of the old DDR. So, again, a complete distortion of history, a complete perversion of history. He also has to throw in the idea that the Soviets were threatening imminent invasion of the West, which is the lie that NATO is built on. There was never any plan by the Soviet high command in military terms or political terms, or the Stalin leadership, never mind Khrushchev, to invade the West. This was all bullshit. It's all literally the opposite way around, which is it was all about basically building a military alliance that could be principally used to brutalize any attempt by the working class populations of Western Europe to push for socialism, to engage in revolutionary processes. That's what, remember, Gladio and things like that were all about. Just go back and revisit the interview I did with Kit Clarenberg last week talking about that. So all of that is bullshit. But this, and we also now get to the meat of what he's really all about, which he's saying, oh, we could extend NATO air defense for Ukraine across 85% of current Kiev-held territory. Well, if you listen to most military experts about NATO air defense, they are saying that you actually couldn't do that. They've tried to move American and Norwegian and German air defense systems into Ukraine, and the Russians have just blown them all up. So again, like, this is operating on a complete fantasy level. And the fantasy being, as I said, that you could move like the Polish or Romanian army into Ukraine to sustain this war, and the Russians wouldn't just immediately go full bore into open warfare against these countries. So again, complete bullshit, complete fantasies. This is the level of deluded brain that we're dealing with here. So let's now move to final quote from Mr. Tisdall, and here we get to what he's really all about. So, final quote: that would provide enhanced air, missile and drone defense without joining the war. It would also allow NATO military response if Russian forces based in occupied territory or Black Sea waters chose to launch additional criminal attacks on civilians like that which killed 7 people in Lvov on Thursday. Now, of course, Mr. Tisdall never mentions the thousands of people who have died in Donbass since 2014, those murdered by the fascist terror gangs across Ukraine in 2014. Those are not worthy victims in his mind because, of course, they were all killed in the interests of British imperialism, which is really what Tisdall's all about defending. So the other thing to mention here is, again, we come back to his fantasies, that if we can just sustain the war and if we can just move NATO air cover in, that we could frustrate the Russians, and it all goes back to the war aims that they had originally, which is that they've got this absolutely deluded and insane idea that all they need to do is to do some big gesture, and then the Russian regime crumbles, that Putin crumbles, that, you know, Prigozhin stages another rebellion, that the oligarchs will stage a revolt, that somebody will take over or the Russian state will just collapse. And all of that has been proven wrong time and time and time again. And as time goes on, the Russian population not only becomes more solidly behind Putin, but also starts to mobilize themselves more and more for the war effort, and that the social forces, the class forces that the imperialists want to rely on, or would have to rely on, the compradors, become weaker and weaker. So this is all just stemming from the fantasy that the NATO military machine is this phenomenal, formidable thing that the dastardly Putin doesn't really dare stand up against. If we just, you know, if we just make a big enough gesture, the Russians will crumble. And again, it is a fantasy. It is the NATO countries who are draining themselves of weaponry and resources. The Russians are barely spending, I think it's not even 5% of GDP on their war effort. They've absorbed the increased costs very easily. So again, like this is the level of fantasy that the British so-called bourgeois intellectual class is living on at the moment. This is the kind of like lunacy that they're engaging in. And what it all comes back to fundamentally, where all this bullshit coming out of British politicians and British bourgeois journalists, is fear. They know very well on one level that they actually can't fight the Russians. Even Tisdall, who's a lunatic, what he's calling for there is to send in the Poles. That's what he's doing. Same as Andrew Neil, another wretched, flaccid coward. They are all calling for essentially Poland to be destroyed in order to carry out their historic mission as being a shield of Western civilization. Poland, by the way, another nation that actually lost independence since 1989. Another question entirely, which we will revisit at some point. But they are basically engaging in this fantasy because they are horribly aware on some level that the plan has gone wrong, that they plan to use shock sanctions to destroy the Russian economy, and that the outsourced army in Ukraine would do the rest to destabilize the dreadful Putin regime and everything would fall apart. All of that has gone. And they, rather than face the reality that now they had to bargain with the Russians, they are desperate just to keep the war going in the hope that at some point, something will come up, something will happen in the future, the whole thing will fall apart. But it won't, of course. This is, as time goes on and as the war goes on, the Russian position gets stronger, and you end up with the bulk of the Ukrainian working class men in particular, being sacrificed so the likes of Mr. Tisdall can continue to draw on his expense account at The Guardian. Because that's what he is. That's what all of these people are. They are scribes for imperialism. Their job is to write these screeds justifying British imperialist activity, rallying support for it. These are propagandists of the lowest and most disgusting kind. And that their lies are becoming ever more ridiculous shows that things are going wrong for them. And we should, of course, welcome that. So, returning to the comments. A lot of the DC Beltway TV gas bags speak in terms of being at war in Ukraine, some feigning concern over cluster munitions, but mostly cheerleading, pouring gasoline on the fire. Yeah, and I think part of that, Philbin, comes from the fact that, well, first of all, these people are stupid as fuck. Let's be honest there. And the other part of it is that they have no conception of a war at all, most of them. And they have no conception of what it would mean for the US to actually go to war against the Russians, which I don't think is going to happen. The brutality and cynicism of this has always been that the role that Ukraine is essentially playing is of a basically live, gigantic human sacrifice for imperialism. An imperialism which is too weak and too cowardly these days to dare to try and do some kind of vast military mobilization of its own population, because they know very well that that population wouldn't stand for it and that they would face an internal rebellion. So they got to get these wretched scumbag comprador bourgeois types in places like Ukraine, and they hope Poland, to sacrifice their own populations for the glories and the continued dominance of American imperialism. And that's what they want to do here. And it's what all their professional propagandists in the media are calling for. And it's completely disgusting. It's disgusting, cynical, brutal, and needs to be exposed as far as we possibly can expose it. And I wish people like Tisdall and pretty much all the UK Parliament were disingenuous and didn't really believe everything they say. Based on the people I've talked to, I don't believe that's true. Oh, well, look, Tisdall, I think, is a little bit cleverer in what he puts out there. He knows on one level that the British can't possibly fight a war with the Russians. That's why he's lining up Poland to do it for them. The cleverer of them are doing that because then they're aware of the weaknesses. The more stupid, like Tobias Ellwood, thinks that you can conjure up a British army out of thin air and an industrial base out of thin air. And that's the way that they're choosing to go with it. So, yeah, some of these people are completely divorced from reality. But fundamentally, what's going to stop them rolling into this war with the Russians is two things. One is the constraints that do exist upon them in terms of their inability to secure the loyalty of the masses towards some kind of mass military mobilization. I don't think that's on the cards for them at all. And secondly is, of course, the industrial deficit. They can't build enough industry quickly enough to be able to enter this war and stand anything like a chance of winning. So these nutbags may well believe that they're propaganda, but when things start to go really, really wrong and they try and mobilize, well, even their own military men are already saying in like fairly right-wing newspapers like the Mail, like saying, you got military officers in there giving statements along the lines of, we've not got enough of anything to be able to challenge the Russians. Even like the one of the generals that's in charge and the defense staff went before Parliament last year and said Russian air defense had destroyed the entire British Air Force in about a week. And all the military men know it. So if the politicians are stupid and suicidal enough to try and walk into a war with the Russians, well, again, I don't think that they have the capability of doing it. Even the crowd around Biden knows it, which is why they're still engaging in these cynical maneuvers involving Poland, which I don't think will come to anything either. I think there's going to be too much domestic opposition in Poland for the Warsaw reactionaries to pull this off. And M. Philbin says, on goes the perpetual Ukrainian spring, counteroffensive any day now. Are there viable socialist opponents in Poland and Eastern Europe against being used as NATO cannon fodder? Not much of it. Well, there are obviously communists in Poland, very marginalized, borderline illegal, very much subject to state repression. There is an opposition, though, and even within petty bourgeois nationalist circles in Poland, there's opposition because they remember the role that the Ukrainian fascists played in World War II, killing thousands and thousands of Poles. And that's a big part of the reason why there's growing trouble in Poland. And, of course, the Polish nationalists are opposed to large-scale Ukrainian migration, partly because a lot of these people turn up speaking Russian. And they're afraid of what that'll mean for the future of their nation. So there's political problems for the Polish reactionaries that they're going to have to deal with. And there's also growing opposition in Bulgaria, and that's part of the reason why the Bulgarian government's become a whole lot less keen on things. They're looking like they'll continue in NATO, of course. They won't openly oppose it, but they're going to have to be more restrained because there's growing domestic opposition based on hostility to NATO, the fact that the Bulgarian political system is very weak. Same in Romania, really. I mean, there's, of course, wild enthusiasm for the West in some aspects of Romanian society, but there's been a series of very corrupt, very despised governments there. They don't have the political strength to carry off the kind of mobilization and war against the Russians that the likes of Tisdall and Andrew Neil want them to do. So again, these are countries that are a lot weaker, and there's more opposition in them than we would be led to believe. Yes, Red Star Betty's right. I think some socialists are getting persecuted in those places. Yeah, they are. Like, you look at Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and you try and be an active communist there. If you'll look on the Telegram channel that I run, I follow a lot of like Baltic Marxist accounts, and you can see that there's people in prison in the Baltic states who are active communists, trade unionists. There's a large level of state repression in all these countries, particularly against communists, as there always is. So these are very repressive, very corrupt places that are essentially run as protectorates of the US empire. And the flip side of that, though, is that the states themselves are authoritarian, deeply corrupt, but also very weak. And if you really believe that the Lithuanian and Latvian and Estonian armies would hold out against a full-scale Russian invasion, well, you must be smoking something very strong. So you get a lot of this shit from commentators all over the place, both on the left and the right now, about how NATO has never been stronger. Just examine what NATO is actually capable of on an industrial and a military level and a political level as well. Like, what kind of strength does the political system have in these countries that would it be capable of doing like the vast military call-ups that would be needed? Could their economies even sustain huge military mobilizations? Are they capable of doing the vast expansion in the military industrial complex that would enable them to wage any kind of effective war against the Russians? And the answer in almost all the cases, even Germany, is no. These are hollowed out, deindustrialized places that have been largely, in the case of Eastern and Central Europe, sacked and destroyed by German imperialism in terms of their manufacturing bases, and aren't capable of sustaining the huge armies they'd require to go over and fight 1 million Russians in Western Russia / Eastern Ukraine. So again, they're not capable of doing it. For all the fantasies that we're going to get coming out of the NATO conference tomorrow, and then across the course of the rest of this week, you'll get a load of hot air and a lot of like blood-curdling statements that, when you actually read them, mean very little. Like all the security guarantees that Zelensky is apparently getting, what do they amount to? More promises of weapons and money and all the other kind of shit, and essentially not very much else. Oh, we'll give you more tanks, we'll give you more missiles, some of which can be sold on the black market. Ultimately, it will mean that basically things continue as they are, because things continuing as they are is the only real consensus that NATO can reach. So, I've been running for about an hour now, so I'm going to call it quits. I'll be back tomorrow with more coverage of the NATO summit and all other kinds of things related to the Ukraine war. Might take in some more British news as well, if anything particularly stupid has happened. But until then, I will bid you adieu, and I will say thank you to everybody in the chat. So thank you to everybody who's tuned in. Ash from Melbourne, Zuleika, Lavitz, Philbin, Kenneth from Norway, Comrade Naylor, Morgan, Paul, HM, Stephen, who else we got here? Red Star Betty, Tomsk, Kelly Bryan, and who else we got here? Dingo Ate Me Baby, always good to see you. And where is Duganism? Big question. I hope that it features on Paul Mason's next Mind Palace. So, thank you to everybody for tuning in. Been a really great one tonight. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.